a real pleasure to have Sofía Hernández Chong Cuy, the director of formerly known as Witte de With Kunstinstituut Melly, with us, and sociologist at Utrecht University, I think, Rolando Vázquez Melken, with us today to talk about the process of unsilencing, unnaming, and of institutional transformation for Witte de With in Rotterdam, now known as Kunstinstituut Melly. My name is Brian Kwan Wood. I'm the Director of Research at the MA Curatorial Practice program at SVA in New York. On behalf of the chair of the program, Stephen Henry Madoff, I'd like to welcome all of you. I'll just briefly begin by outlining a few questions. Two questions, actually, well, maybe 2 times 5 or so, as Sofía pointed out, that I posed to our speakers today. My first question for them was what brought about the need to reconsider the naming of Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art, which was founded in 1990, right? So more than 30 years ago. Which members of the larger community felt this need most acutely? Did others put up resistance, or were there points of tension? Did these calls for change reflect larger political currents or needs in the Netherlands, in Europe, or even beyond? That was the first question. Second, how did Witte de With, it's the institutional question, how did Witte de With create an infrastructure and set of processes to examine the problem and its larger implications? How did this process lead to the creation of Kunstinstituut Melly, both as a new name and perhaps a new institution altogether? In what ways was this process painful or generative, and for whom? Also, they've done a number of videos. I think it's and talks. I think it's called Melly TV on this topic, focusing on it completely. And in these, they've often described the process as a joyful process, which I think is important to bear in mind, right? In spite of the tensions, the process was a joyful one. And I asked them also, what else did it create? How do you see this process more broadly as a model for how institutions can respond to their own contradictions or to problematic or insufficient responses to history more generally? Clearly, it is something that so many institutions in the Western world want to do, but often, especially in the US, often don't know where to start. But we know where to start. We will start with Sofía. It's really nice to have you with us, Sofía.
Thank you so much, Brian, and Stephen for the invitation, and Brian for those questions. And I'm very happy here to be this afternoon with you all, and with Rolando accompanying me here, a Mexican colleague, who him and I are in some way involved in a larger movement in the Netherlands. And that was not exactly planned, but I love that it's happening. I wanted to mention that I love the SVA curating program. Maybe Brian and Stephen have mentioned that I taught there just before I came here to Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And as we are speaking, one of the former students of the SVA curator program Andrea, she's there, yay! So I wanted to mention that in my first year at the institution, we had Andrea as a curatorial intern for that summer, and she did amazing work with us. And part of that work was working as an exhibition coordinator with us of the retrospective of Cecilia Vicuña, an artist originally from Chile, based in New York. And Andrea is remotely installing that exhibition right now at Centro de Arte 2 de Mayo in Spain. So there's a deep connection, not only of me as a teacher, but someone that as a student there, interned with us here in Rotterdam, and that stayed on board in our institution, still working. So I'm very happy that she's here present. Thank you, Andrea. And thank you, Brian, for having recommended Andrea to us. So very briefly, I will give you a sense of the name change initiative at our institution, but at the invitation of Brian and the suggestion of Rolando, there is an interest for me to describe how the perception of the institution was felt, at least from my part, before I arrived here to Rotterdam. And having studied also curating in New York at Bard College back in the 90s, so a long time ago. And I will tell you that at that time, when I was a student of curatorial studies at Bard College in the 1990s, when much of the conversations and the definitions around curating and an expanded curatorial practice that had to do with minor histories and a debate very much about centers and peripheries, Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art was a reference. The institution opened in 1990 in the city of Rotterdam, and the first director was Chris Durkin. He is someone that was actually working at MoMA PS1, or at PS1 Center for Contemporary Art, now known as MoMA PS1. And he was working there on exhibitions in the 1980s. And when he arrived to Rotterdam to open the institution was already in a way defined to be an institution that would focus on contemporary art, that would bring someone from abroad that to direct it, so that they could bring not only an international network to the Netherlands and to Rotterdam specifically, but also so that the institution could really present in the Netherlands and in Europe kind of avant-garde that was being described as a revisionism of art history, and the creation also of site-specific work and work that was developed through community engagement. Chris Durkin, as said, was coming from PS1, and just before he had arrived to Rotterdam, the institution had already been on a blueprint for 2 years. And the name was originally Kunsthaus, the House of Art. And 3 months before it opened, and it was when it was registered as a stichting, or what we would call a nonprofit or foundation, it was registered with Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art, meaning the original name that had been used in all the blueprints of the formation of the institution for 2-3 years had been Kunsthaus. But just before it opened, it was called Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art. The name is drawn from the street. We are located on Witte de With number 50. And in New York, which is where I believe most of you are, you can find a lot of references of this type of institutional naming, including PS1, Public School Number 1, meaning it used an existing building that had been abandoned or that was partially used, and it took it up to use those very raw rooms as its own exhibition space. And this is not just PS1, it's in general a historical trend in the 20th century. A more recent space that had in New York also much appeal, it was an artist-run center created on Orchard Street in the Lower East Side, and the space organized by artists, among them Jason Simon, Andrea Fraser, Philip Mueller, and so many others. They called Moira Davy, they called it Orchard. And maybe you were not living in New York at that time yet, but that was a very, very important space where the artists there both organized exhibitions, exhibited there, and created much of the discourse. I would say that other names, the power plant in Toronto in Canada, and so on, follow the same history. So maybe it's unclear to me yet how it was changed to Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art. It is unclear to me, although word says that maybe it is the fact that when Chris Durkin was coming from PS1, there was a change of thought that maybe the institution should also have its location as part of the name. What is important to know is that already in the late 1980s, the city of Rotterdam, meaning the municipality, had done a lot of investment to use that street to so-called clean it up as part of an urban development that would in a way remove a number of the prostitution houses that were sited there and populate the street with art galleries that arrived there in the 1980s and other kinds of cultural establishments that could connect two points in the city. So if I have my little instance thing here, this is a maritime museum in the city of Rotterdam. This is a Boymans Museum, which is a museum. It's the museum with the largest collection here in Rotterdam. Actually, the photography museum has a bigger collection. And this is a museum park. And our institution is sited in the center. That's one thing. The second thing is that, meaning they already called it the Art Boulevard, the Museum Boulevard. There were many different campaigns, cultural campaigns that were going on there. Now, who is Witte de With beyond a street is where the controversy around our name began in 2017. Witte de With is not just the name of the street, it's actually a street that was named in the 19th century based on the namesake of an officer that, a naval officer that worked for the VOC, which is the East India Company, and which is in the 17th century considered the birth of capitalism. And this is not according to me or according to some journalists. This is to most historians that have written about the economy and economic history. The VOC is considered one of the key transnational capitalist models where it's a, I'm not going to go into that because it's a long story, but basically, Witte de With was a man and he worked for the VOC in the 19th century. And part of the VOC was very much exploring and the world. They had the Netherlands in the 17th century had the most important and fierce vessels, marine vessels, and they pretty much conquered most of Asia and took different bases or ports in South Africa and other places. They eventually also opened the West India Company and they colonized part of Brazil. They negotiated New York for Suriname with the British. And so basically the history of the colonial expansion of the Netherlands and this large global market trade system that they created through the VOC was what Witte de With the man represented. This is the 19th century. He was not exactly the most well-known Dutch naval officer. Cohen perhaps is the one that's most well-known. But what I want to mention with this is that even though these figures represented the so-called golden age, at least economically speaking, certainly culturally speaking as well in terms of the artistic production made during that time, um, the real positioning or veneration, the remembrance of these figures took place in the 19th century, in the late 19, in the late 1870s to be exact. Most of the street names, most of the statues, most of the historical references that made a claim about the wealth and the beauty and the strength of the nation of the Netherlands, as we know it today, were recovered from the 19th century, the 1870s to be, again, more precise. Our building, which is a humongous building, very much in the vein of the history, again, of PS1. And I wanted to make this reference not only because Chris Dirk and the first director was coming from there, but because it's a venue that many of you may be familiar with being from New York or being studying in New York. Our building was also constructed in the 1870s, and it was constructed as a school, as a women's school that was part of a new civic school movement that was taking place there. So that's the background. I arrived, as I said, 3 years ago here to direct the institution, at that time called Witte de With, and or generally called that way, and now, as of a couple of weeks, called Kunstinstituut Melly. I arrived there in 2018, and my recollections and my references to the institution had been, since I was studying curatorial studies at Bard College in the 1990s, as the institution that brought a curating to another level. It was the exemplary institution for thinking about exhibition series. For example, the one that Catherine David had organized when she was director there, just immediately after having curated Documented 10. She created an exhibition series where, over the course of 3 years, all the programs would focus on what she called Arab image representations, a Arab instead of Middle Eastern, so that she could focus on a shared language in a region that could also speak to a visual language that would be politically motivated by the circumstances of a geopolitical area. Um, Beforehand, in the case of the time of Chris Durkan, and still until today considered among his program one of the most important exhibitions, not only at that time, but for the institution and certainly for the artist, they organized a retrospective of Elio Itisica, which really brought the artist to be known and become being collected on an international circuit. And that exhibition was organized together with Guy Brett, who just passed away last week, and Chris Durkan and Kathy Halbrecht participated as well. It toured and included the Walker Art Center as well. So so that's just one. They did so many radical projects in the early 90s at that institution and throughout the last couple of decades, that it was a key reference point for younger curators like me at that time to be inspired and to see what you could do with an art institution or an art institution, even if the artists did not yet have a market or even if the artists were not well known. This was a place that helped shape histories, art histories, reviewing art histories, and that helped become a kind of jumping board for many of the emerging or unknown artists that were being presented there. At my arrival there, the 3 years ago, the institution was perceived completely different than how I had been looking at it from New York. The institution had gone through a year of a lot of heated debate in the press and in the arts community about the fact that they were organizing critical programs and exhibitions without being self-critical about using decolonizing within their own language to describe the direction of a program without actually having noticed that the institution bared a name that was associated to colonial history. And the critique that was made public at that time in 2017 was that it was not just about a name, but that it was to reconsider a name that also symbolized a kind of work culture at the institution or a Western perspective in terms of Western art history, a way of seeing a modernity or the contemporary through a kind of worldview that is informed academically, but through an academy that is primarily constructed around Western thinking. So that is what happened. And just a couple of months before I arrived, and pretty much a week before I was publicly announced as a director, they tasked me to uh, take on the responsibility of changing the name for the institution, a decision which was made a week before my announcement, and in which I did not necessarily participate in that decision making. And it was clear to me that at my arrival, the decision making about what name the institution would have and what a name change meant would have to actually be designed through a collective decision making process, so that the feeling of total de-uprooting, so to say, was not felt again by a larger community that had been a stakeholder or an audience member for a long time at the institution. So there were many things that involved for a name change, but that was just a quick intro, as quick as I could do. And now I'm going to pass it on to Rolando, because otherwise I will not stop talking, and Brian knows that that's a major problem I have. But maybe Rolando can speak a little bit about the context, and then I can show graphs and stuff like that, so that I don't take over the full thing, because I am totally immersed, just so you guys know, in this history, particularly of the 19th century at this point. So, Rolando, maybe you want to kick in?
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Brian. Uh, I would like to ask those that feel comfortable if you can turn on your cameras so that at least we see some faces. That would be really nice in these times of social distancing. At least we can see each other. And you can make gestures and raise your hands and things like that. Thank you. Um, well, I want to elaborate a little bit on what Sofia was talking about. And so, well, first, how the VOC, the commercial company of Dutch colonialism, that was very particular because the VOC is a moment when we see the birth of the global corporation. So today, in the arts, as in many other disciplines, the corporation is a central actor in the world. And we know many corporations are more powerful, sometimes even than presidents, as we have seen, but more powerful than many nation states. But the VOC is really a very prominent part of the history of the corporation. So colonialism comes with the invention of the global corporation. And this global corporation is a corporation that has a very complex history because it involved the enslavement of millions of people, right? So here is where the decolonial critique comes in that I won't have time to explain in detail, but the decolonial critique says that we cannot understand global capitalism, global development, the global contemporary without the history of coloniality, the history of enslavement, the history of exploitation of others. And this raises very important ethical questions. So I would say that the moment of the name change at Witte de With and the controversy around it is a historical junction between very long-standing debates in the Netherlands, an activism fighting racism in the Netherlands, that is a country that imagines itself as without racism and as tolerant, but that is deeply racist in its structures, and a country that has invested a lot in forgetting its colonial history and how it has been implicated in the history of enslavement. And so the activism of the people of color in the Netherlands has been, um, let's say, has been there since the beginning, but in the recent years it became very prominent. And, and the arts played a very important role in this. So if you're interested, you can follow that. For example, the campaign of Zwarte Piet's racism was an art project that became that opened a national debate because Zwarte Piet is a figure for children in the Christmas period that portrays an enslaved person and that makes fun of an enslaved person. But the general consciousness in the country will deny that. So the moment of the name change, the formerly called Witte de With, is a moment where this activism of anti-racist struggle in the Netherlands, something also, of course, in relation internationally with Black Lives Matter and with the movements in the US, but with a distinct history, uh, encounters another movement that is coming up in, let's say, in other circles, that is the decolonial critique. the development of decolonial thought. And so well, together with Walter Mignolo, I have been coordinating the Decolonial Summer School for the last 13 years. And in this summer school, very early on from the first year of the school, we had the debates of anti-racism in the Netherlands. So it is a junction that enables, let's say, this anti-racist political activism to have a very strong theoretical backbone that basically says you cannot keep the name of a naval officer that was complicit with enslavement and with genocide all over the world and be holding exhibitions that are looking towards a global ethics or towards social justice or that are anti-racist. So this is the moment that puts the institution in a huge pressure to transform its name, but the name was a moment for institutional transformation. So it was not just about a marketing issue. Okay, let's drop this name of this white conqueror and let's put another name. But it was a moment of, the name was a symbol that these institutions were white institutions and were close to the diversity of society, and particularly Rotterdam in this case. So we see here another junction that is, or the transformation between unnaming and renaming. Unnaming was about, well, this name is complicit with the erasure of other voices and other histories. So the renaming has to be an act of unsilencing. And here is where the decolonial critique of epistemology, so of our forms of naming, generally of our forms of knowledge, is extended towards a decolonial praxis of governance and institutional transformation. So I think that is the beauty of this moment that we are living together with Sofía here in the Netherlands, where the epistemic critique comes together with the activism and is leading towards forms of institutional transformation that require two things. One is allowing, I think we have learned through also the workshops and the reflections, that the institutions that hold themselves as innocent and pure are not tenable anymore. Institutions have to recognize how they are implicated in a global history of injustice, of social and earth ecological injustice. So we think institutions have to work with those contradictions and renounce that position of abstract innocence, or that pretense of innocence, that pretense of purity. And this is, of course, I mean, I don't have time to expand on this, but this is, of course, one of the major arguments of decolonial feminism, like the work of Maria Lugones, that will say there is no position of purity. There is no pure subject. We cannot attain that pure name that will be all good. We have to deal with the contradictions, and we have to acknowledge that. So one of the reflections with Melly Art Institute has been, and is now, and is one of the big challenges, is how to remain vulnerable, how to remain in a space of contestation. So the challenge of the name put the institution in such a tension that, at least that's my personal opinion, the result should not be to build back a solid, let's say, patriarchal institution, but to remain in that tension as really one of the forms that institutions have to take today in their acknowledgement of their being complicit with what we call the colonial difference. One more thing before I stop. So here I want to make a bit more of a theoretical point, which is more my field of work, and well, one of my fields of work, I should say, and is how decolonial critique is not just any critique. You know, people like Rancière or like Foucault or like Deleuze, they are very good critical thinkers, but they are not decolonial thinkers, right? And Why? Because the colonial critique is about undoing coloniality. And these great thinkers were not concerned with coloniality. And so when you are performing the colonial critique, you're performing a critique that is oriented towards undoing coloniality and hence overcoming a modernity that was constituted on coloniality. The second point I want to make in this final minute is, in this sense, we have also been challenging very big concepts in the arts like the contemporary, right? So who validates the contemporary? Where the idea of time of the contemporary comes from? And we think from our proposal of decolonial aesthesis that the contemporary should be over. We're calling for the end of the contemporary because it has been a structure of validation that has kept intact the colonial difference. And so if we are moving towards a decolonial aesthesis, then the contemporary should finish and institutions should become not the spaces that control enunciation and the sovereignty, the imperial sovereignty of representing the world or the idea of the nation with their names or with their curatorial practices, but they should become spaces of listening. So what we are saying is, how can we move from a politics of representation and the power of representation to develop the capacity of reception, to politics of listening? This is, in our view, this is what the decolonial is bringing into these debates. So I think we are at a very beautiful historical moment and joyful in a way, because these social movements that are anti-racist movements have entered in this junction with these theoretical positions of decoloniality that many of them come from Abya Yala, from Latin America, and it has become a very productive encounter between these very different trajectories of struggle, because decoloniality is informing the struggles of the Americas, especially of First Nations and indigenous peoples and Afro peoples in the Americas, not just in North America. And this encounter with anti-racist struggles in Europe and with the challenge of decolonizing Europe as well, a Europe that needs to overcome its own Eurocentrism. And I think that is the moment in which Witte de With becomes a very special place where this transformation is happening and these debates are becoming tangible. Thank you. I will leave it there. Thanks.
So how does that look in practice? I was wondering if you want me to show you like a little graph, no? Of a applicability of theory into practice. Should I just do it? Share screen? A ver. Are you able to see? Yeah. So one of the things that there's a number of things that were very important from Rolando's response right now or presentation, and one of them has to do not only with time, but also in terms of the contemporary, but also in terms of the things that have to happen in time. And one of them is structural changes, and to understand the distinction between a structural or political change as different from a symbolic change. And for sure, the process of the name change as an initiative has taken not only a lot of time that has been necessary, sometimes think that we need more time, but has also been based pretty much in the questions around listening and methods of deep listening and not just of seeing. And within the field of the visual arts, I have to say that this is a big tension because everyone wants to see things and not just listen to things. So I will be very visual right now in showing you a graph. Can you see my little mouse there as well? Can you see the little mouse?
Yes.
Floating? Great. Thank you. So I will be very graphic and visual right now in showing you how, in a way, the trajectory of the initiative has developed, where you could see that the renaming process is just here in this period, happening just here in 2020, but many other things take place before and happen also in parallel. The first thing that happened was, of course, the acknowledgement. This is prior to my arrival. This happened throughout a number of discussions internally with a group of people and artists specifically, who were the ones that instigated the change by writing an open letter to the institution that was signed by numerous amounts of people. And in that fall, the institution decided to make the name change and acknowledged it. Acknowledgement did not just happen there with a statement. For me, acknowledgement and for our team in general has to continue happening throughout the entire time. We have to continuously acknowledge different facets and different aspects of change. But for sure, at arriving, one of the things that I knew was that the plan was going to take time to develop, and that during that time there had to be at least a progress report a year. And in 2020, there were a number of them to explain where we were in the process of change, what the initiative entailed, how it was shaping up and such. At the same time, one of the things that I felt was that the institution was very alone, not only because of the debates and the amount of tension that had publicly provoked in the Netherlands for a name change. It's not only that the institution had been alone for many years because perhaps it was too academic or theoretical for general audiences, but also for other reasons, which had to do with the fact that it made one big event and then smaller backstage programs. For me, what was very important was to create a audience that would become more comfortable and familiar with the space, and that new public and even long-standing public with their recurrence and repeated visits could actually form a community that would become supportive for the institution. So in 2018, two things happened, which was to change really the strategies for public engagement. So it was not just exhibition oriented, but really focused on public engagement. And the two things that happened there was one was spatial, was to turn around a white cube gallery space that was in the ground floor and to turn it into a space of activities that was a little bit ambiguous, not sexually, but almost, in the sense that it was a gallery or a bookshop. It had cantina. It was for events. It was displaying art and also documents. So you had different layers of presentation and program activities. And the second one was to make it free and to do events every single weekend. And that every single weekend for free, events that varied from a concert to an artist talk to a seminar to a workshop would allow for, again, that recurring audience to begin forming and to begin meeting, to begin feeling comfortable in the space. And with that came an education project called the Work Learn program that in the first edition, now we're in the third edition, they were tasked, there were a group of young students at that time between 17 to 23 who studied with us and worked with us for a period of 6 months, and that had as their year graduation project, so to say, after having had seminars and workshops around identity, marketing, business, hospitality even, and art history, to come up with a name for the ground floor gallery. And they came up with a name, Melly, from Melly Shum Hates Her Job, the artwork of Ken Lum. That happened in 2019, even though the program had begun in 2018 and is still going on. The third edition of that Work Learn program are a group of 6 young graphic designers who have designed our new identity for Kunstinstituut Melly, and who tomorrow we meet for a 5-hour seminar, because in this case, we're not teaching it or learning together. We're actually brought in 2 designers, Prem Krishnamurthy from New York, who runs workshops at this point from Berlin. And the second one, Armand Mevis, who is the director of Workplaats, the postgraduate school of graphic design in Arnhem here in the Netherlands. So jointly, we have developed this third edition of the Work Learn program, which is part of our philosophy of collective learning, which means we all get together and learn about design, decolonizing design, identities, and Things take a long time, but it's very fun and experimental. During this time, staff hires were done. Part of the idea of changing and becoming socially aware of changes that could also be manifested in the institution or be inspiring from our institution to the larger society is to change perspectives, specifically to diversify the team. So those were a number of hires that had been done, effectively happening, including a curator for collective learning, Jesse Koyman, a position for research and programs manager, Vivian Zerl, who I know will be giving a talk at SVA soon, and a position, Heba Soliman, that would help us become practically a more hospitable institution. She's a guest experience manager. She trains, she hires all the people that are the first face of our institution, that pretty much are the gallery attendants, the hosts, mediators, and such. Now she's been promoted to that position. The board recruitments have been happening with the same idea to diversify the perspectives, to ground ourselves also more locally. We brought in an architectural historian. We brought in a person that specialty is focused in the global south. We brought in a person that has been working on aspects of decolonizing from the museum world, specifically the Vanabe. So Yolande van der Solis from Yolande van der Heide is curator of Vanabe Museum here in the Netherlands, which has a wonderful program. Fariba from the Prince Claus, Anushka from Crimson Architectural Historians, and that has to do with my fascination right now with the 19th century. And Time Hirlov, we always need those lawyers. He focuses on copyright. Team trainings, everything from de-escalation to questions around design to aspects of disability and accessibility have been part of our recurring staff trainings so that we can also create a deeper awareness, and of course creating a new policy that involves a 4-year work plan that kicks in this year and follows the next 4 years, that will bring the institution into become a more caring place and still a daring and innovative institution. The renaming process, which is what I want to go to, which is here, and the new name, which was just launched a couple of weeks ago, involved a process that, as I said, involved much learning and certainly through listening. And Rolando participated in that process in different ways. First, I'm going to show you what really was voiced. This is a very, very small summary of what was voiced as the key things that we could work on from the institution. One of them was that we didn't have to forget our history, we just had to reframe it. We have to think about it differently. The second is that we had to select a name and develop a program that, that demanded the accountability that the public had already been expecting from us since 2017. There was something that actually was quite interesting, which was that many of the participants of this public input phase that was involved in the renaming process, many of the expressions was that a lot of them being Dutch citizens, they said that they actually didn't know anything about the colonial history until the debate of our name change. And what they asked us was, can you, I mean, if you're going to change the name, how do we not forget this process so that it's still in the public sphere, so that it's still part of a public debate, and so that we continue learning more about the colonial history of the Netherlands? So it was very clear that what they were asking was that we not only continue doing educational programming that would open up a rereading of history and increase the amount of voices and narratives within that, but also that we, with our context, could actually work in educational reform to lobby and advocate for that, which we are doing. And they also demanded something that was quite basic, which was you have to communicate better. A large aspect of inclusivity is just how you communicate. You don't have to dumb things down, you just have to communicate differently so that you can continue involving your long-standing art experts because you are creating new art histories, but also because you are trying to speak to people that may have never felt comfortable at an art institution or museums, which brings me to the final point, is how can you create a safe space, even if it's a daring experimental place? The public process or public input phase of the renaming process was very beautiful, I would say. And I have to say that the entire process has been quite challenging in the sense that we collapsed from being extremely exhausted and so criticized. A lot of it in social media, of course, in television, we were vandalized. So it's been 3 years that I cannot believe that we've survived, I must say, and that I'm still here sitting talking about the story. But basically, we have a very beautiful team at the institution. And from that team, we created a task force, or what we eventually called the working group, that consisted of our communications manager, Jeroen Lavin, Jesse Koyman, who's a curator of collective learning, Lynn Kramer, who's a technician and who has been at the institution for almost 30 years, Rosa de Graaf, curator, myself there, and Vivian Zerl, who was one of the new hires and whose background is not only in theory, but in activism as well, and who very much helped design and execute the renaming input public phase. There's more people that are not listed here, but there's a whole list of credits in our website. We developed an online survey. We developed forums. We actually made four forums where people were able to voice their ideas, workshop ideas. One of these was moderated by Rolando Vázquez Melken, who developed a forum that actually included a listening exercise so that everyone could be heard. From each of these forums, there was a report made, but there was no visual documentation produced. We had an advisory committee that brought people from different expertise, different countries, and also very much from Rotterdam, different communities here, who gave us advice in terms of the names that were shortlisted from these processes. We had a public review event that also Rolando participated to give his own feedback. And then in that public review, we made basically public. Actually, Rolando was the one that pressured me to do this one. I didn't want to do it because I'm like, it's going to be a moment where everyone's going to throw tomatoes. It didn't happen. But during that process, we made the entire findings open. We said what the advisory committee had voted on, how it was different from what came from the forums, what we had learned, what were we expecting. It was an all-day thing because of social distancing. We could only have 30 people in the room, so we had to do it at 3, at 4, at 5, and so on until we served all the people that had registered. And then finally, I took a report with my suggestions to the supervisory board. And after that, there was a deliberation and the name announcement. To be very frank, the name change is, I'm sorry about the ambulances. The name change has been a very long process of a number of years. We're not finished yet. There are a number of things that are to happen. And among them is, in fact, with this experimental group, is actually to get the design in place. We're building a new website. But what has happened in the last couple of weeks is the launch and celebration of the new name, which was organized as a 3-episode television show that was broadcast in television here in the Netherlands, and that was online available via eFlux. Thanks, Brian, and his team there, and also on our websites. Thousands of people have seen it. I'm so happy about that because such a complex discussion, debate has been very much welcomed by audiences of different kinds. And even if people disagree with the name given, even if people disagree with the name change, at least they have allowed it now to happen. Back in 2017, and even a year ago, there were riots for why we were having to change the name. A part of our institution's funding comes from public subsidy. In 2017, it was a topic of discussion in Congress, brought by some council members to remove the public funding from our institution because of the lack of patriotism that we were showing. And at this point, what I feel is all the contrary. Now I feel that, yeah, that we are in a good place, and that the change has been accepted, and that we are garnering a much more support for what's to come. So that's a brief. And we have a website, Kunstinstituut Melly, where you can see the TV shows, and more information will be uploaded in March.
Thanks so much, Sofia. So it's really great. I think like the graphs go way beyond anything one could expect when asking about the institutional transformation. It's very, very complex and really, but also really really clearly presented. I think we have just a few minutes for Q&A, as we only have an hour. I think for the first question, I will turn it to Karina Martinez, one of our students. Go for it, Karina.
Hi, Sofia and Rolando. Thank you so much for your talk. I guess I'm wondering what kind of challenges have come about this, like within the institution. Like, has there been a lot of negotiation amongst the staff and committee, or is everybody more or less on board with the same vision or the project of decolonizing? And yeah, if you have anything to speak on that, thank you.
That's a very good question, Karina. And I will tell you that right now, the team is joyful, celebrating, supportive, and really bonded. We're all working towards the same cause. But I have to say that it took a while for that to happen. 2017 was a very traumatic year for the institution. The staff there has always been very loyal, very hardworking, and the critiques, and many of the people that are there are Caucasian, they're basically white. So the critiques were taken very personal. It's very difficult not to take the critiques personal, particularly in the age of social media. And when I arrived there was a lot of yeah, people were not happy, and they were not happy because the institution had done a number of very radical projects, and then suddenly none of it had been recognized. So that was one thing. The other thing is that it was very unclear. As I said, not many have learned or have known about colonial history. So if you don't know, it's very difficult to appreciate the other's position or to be empathetic. So a process of learning had to be, had to take motion. And yeah, and I think that that's how it was. I would say that when in June of last year, when the Black Lives Matter movement really became a global movement, there was also a lot of anxiety from the team that the traumas of 2017 were going to be lived again, because we were very criticized on the one hand by a group saying that we were so late, that why didn't we change, and that we were not being attentive. And then there was another group that was also saying don't change. So the pressures were coming everywhere. And even if the process of doing things slowly and structurally and not only symbolically had been supported, most people turned at that time, right? That's what happens in debate. So at that time, there was a lot of anxiety in the team and a lot of pressure, like, change it now, give it a name. And I'm like, okay, let me find out names. And I'm like, what are we going to do with all this process? The whole point was not to make a decision alone, but to involve people. We had to pause things because of social distancing. So all those tensions generated anxiety, but all in all, the team has been very supportive. The board has been very supportive, and we've all learned a lot, and there's still a lot to learn. Transformations are still underway and will continue happening. So that's that. I think that the hardest people to convince have been stakeholders. And by that, I mean people that are the decision makers for funding and that have accompanied the institution for quite some time, or that are new in the funding scheme. And all those are being, all those relations are being dealt or have been dealt with a lot of care. It's also brought many new supporters, the name change and that process. So I think that yeah, there's different camps. I would say the tensions are in different camps, and they have, it's just a roller coaster. They're not, you know, it doesn't just change all well or all at the same time.
So maybe I can, I think we're pretty much out of time, but there are two additional questions. Maybe I could just sort of summarize them as one question, and we can close on that. The first of the questions is from David Felipe Suarez Mira. Hey, David. Thank you for this mindful presentation, also for giving us a general sense of the transformation, not just about the Kunstinstituut, but also a context of cultural life in Rotterdam. I want to recover the research published in 2017, Archival Metabolism, toward a 21st century archive theory without a theory, and ask you a few questions. Can you tell us more about Melly Shum's history and how you and your team decided to choose the name? Citing Doreen Mende, who was part of this publication, how do you give voice to the undutiful daughter in brief examples? How do you deal with local and international artistic production? This is many questions, so we will have to pick and choose. How have been the discussions of Melly's transformation with other large-scale institutions that are also pointing to a similar direction, such as the Stedelijke Tropien and so on? The second question is congratulations. This is from Kimberly Rush Doiguleur. It says, congratulations, you pushed through the difficulties and change has come. I'm interested in knowing more about your strategy to create more community engagement, offering a free event every weekend. Can you talk about how long it took you to gain the trust and participation of the community?
Mm-hmm. So since there's many questions, and in the interest of time, Brian, do you want to select one or two? Which one?
Maybe I will pick from David's question about Melly Shum's history. I think also the artwork by Ken Lum has a nice kind of local lore. And then from Kimberly's a question of, I think the center of it is really about creating community engagement and gaining the trust and participation of the community.
Okay, so first, why don't we begin with Melly Shum, because it's fun. So you can see Melly Shum here, correct? And I will just put it there for a bit because it's beautiful, I think. Melly Shum. And I will give you a brief about who she is and how she feels about the song and such. Firstly, this artwork, Melly Shum Hates Her Job, is a billboard quite big that's in the facade of our building. And it's been there since our foundation in 1990. It was actually hung at the end of 1990. And it was part of an exhibition that Ken Lum, the Canadian artist that is now teaching in Philadelphia, had at our institution and also the Winnipeg Art Gallery at that time. It was a collaborative project. Melly Shum was a student of Ken Lum, and she was this is in Vancouver. Melly Shum was studying art, and she and other of her classmates participated in a photo series that Ken Lum, one of the conceptual artists from Canada, from the same generation of photo conceptualism that came from Vancouver, for those art historians there. He had this photo series that was involving these diptychs. The younger group of participants of the Work Learn program called it a proto-meme. They said it's a proto-meme, you know, memes that you're using in the internet and the WhatsApp and such. And I actually felt that it was quite interesting, and this is their first attraction to it, was that it was a work that they had grown to see in Rotterdam since they were children. Their building, as I said initially, is in a very prominent street of Rotterdam in the downtown area. It's the lively street to go out for a drink or for a hamburger or just to walk. It has many shops. And the billboard has been there for 30 years. So you can imagine that the parents and the of this group of youngsters that were there, who are also from Rotterdam, and them had grown with this work. And Rotterdam is a very working class city, very proudly so. And the image of Melly Shum had resonated very much to Rotterdammers to become a city icon. After the exhibition in 1990, they put it down and people demanded that it was back up. There was a renovation, they put it down for the renovation and people demanded they put it back up. So the city has fallen in love with this artwork, and a lot of it has to do with the message, Melly Shum hates her job. And the original intent of that message is connected to the history of immigration. But whether you know it or not, it just speaks to people. The history of immigration that it calls, and that you could read in the artist statement about this work, is that Ken Lum felt very privileged to be a second generation Chinese Canadian that had that was studying art, that was teaching art. Whereas his grandparents had moved from China to Canada and worked in the railroad construction, and that the life of immigrants, and particularly the first group of immigrants that comes to a country, really had a hard time at their jobs, and that they are working to create opportunities, better opportunities for others. Now, the context of this work is that you have to realize that Rotterdam is made up of 60% immigrant communities, first Dutch citizens, and which one or both parents have been born abroad, see? And the main communities where they have come from are from North Africa and from Suriname and the Dutch Antilles. So it's a it's a city that has not only a contemporary, it's called super diversity in port cities, but it's also one that is shared in other port cities, right? To make the story short, it wasn't the general public only that promoted the name Melly. The first time that it was named Melly, our institution, was just the downstairs gallery space. And that name was given by the young participants in that work-learn program. That program was to not only diversify our institution, but to open up and precisely to gain the trust, which leads me to the next question. Meaning, the idea was that they participated in a program where they could have a role in decision-making in the institutional transformation. So when they were in charge of changing that name, it was not even my idea to do this, by the way. Yeah, it was the idea of Yuri, this guy that used to work there. And I said, okay, sounds good, but just that space. I said, just the space downstairs, and we're going to use it as a case study. Me coming from academia, thinking that we had to learn from projects and then from there, use that experience to build up or to scale up. So it was them, the young group, that said, let's call it Melly. And among the many reasons were the reasons of artistic intent, were the reasons of how important this artwork had become to the city, and also because it was a proto-meme. And I'm like, what? You know, a proto-meme, a kind of image text in which visual culture is now geared towards. So for that, that was also something that was relevant, the kind of visual language that conceptual work portrayed. And in the end, the naming of Kunstinstituut Melly, for me, is that, meaning that we are called Melly, it's also a way to differentiate that it's not just this bottom space that we have an entire building, but also to refer back to our vocation for art. So that's why adding Art Institute. And certainly for me, it is that if this was a name that was championed, not only by the advisory committee, but in the public review by many of the audiences and also stakeholders, it was because, to me, in my pop psychology, they were championing it because it represented potentiality. Meaning it was not just that it represented an artwork or the institution's history or immigrant life or identification with a character, but that people had seen how much the space downstairs had transformed, that it meant that if you name the entire institution Kunstinstituut Melly, then it represented that potential for a collective decision-making, institutional transformation, and so many things to be felt. So that's my pop psychology in terms of, but there's many different interpretations of the choice. And I think that the trust, to follow that with the other question, is that I think that the trust is not fully gained. I think that the trust is something that is still in under construction, with some communities more than others. But I think that it has been built to a large extent by what Rolando is saying, is that you have to introduce other perspectives. And that means that you have to acknowledge other forms of knowledge, other forms of thinking that are not just structured around the Western canon or that Western time frame, that don't only use that language or those references, whether are historical or theoretical, that acknowledge forms of communication that are not just representational visually, but that are also being voiced or heard, where the body, in fact, has a lot to say. And that's something that already happened in art history in the 90s that we forgot, which is site specificity, right? The whole theory around site specificity was also to break down with the Cartesian model of looking at and instead feeling throughout, no? And I'm not going to say, oh, that's phenomenology from the Western canon. I mean, that's part of indigenous knowledge as well. So trust is under construction, but it has been built progressively, and it has been built by listening and also by being there, by participating, attending what others do, recognizing the ecosystem, the larger ecosystem, and not just the primary players, but in general, the players that are also in the background, which are on the one hand are workers, but they're also for sure archivists, for sure policymakers, yeah, and all the people that beside artists or curators, for example, do not have the visibility in these forums, but that there's much to learn from them in order to shape institutions of the day and for the future. So that's that, and to have a lot of fun. I think that if you're having fun, you also, I think, gain the trust of others. Although for sure there's some suspicious people there, but I think that the good energy generally attracts good energy.
Thank you, Sofía. I think next time we can focus much more on the suspicious people for the sequel. This was really generous. Thank you really so much, Rolando, Sofía, for sharing your thinking with us today. Hope to do it again.
And Rolando participates in the second episode of Melly TV, which is online on YouTube. And also yesterday, the staff has a dance there. They do a fashion show. So I cannot even believe that they did that, because they are, yeah, so bold of them, but they're like all dancing and so on. So you can see that as well, so that you can see how fun it's had. No? Oh, yeah,
Yes.
Vera, I just saw you.
Thank you. I mean, for me, one of the great things of the process is how such a difficult process becomes very powerful when you open it. So the strength of how things were done and the possibility of change was because it became an open process that allowed the tensions to come out in the open. And this was its strength. Instead of avoiding these difficult conversations, it opened a space for them, and it allowed for different voices. And I think it shows the beauty of a, let's call it a democratic process, of a process of consultation, where there is a collective thinking happening, and there are not just decisions made in another room for everybody. So I think this is, the process itself has been a big lesson in governance and in how to, how to deal with these issues today. So I'm really glad we had this conversation. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Sofía, as well.
Thank you, Rolando, for being with us. And also we've learned so much with you.